Well, good morning. It is so good that you are here. My name's Wayne. I'm one of the ministers at Caution Baptist Church, whoever you are and wherever you are and whenever it is that you're watching this service. It is so good that you're here and you are very welcome. And I want to, before I get into the message, I just want to thank everyone who has started giving to our gift day so that we can update all the technical stuff, the equipment at church, so that not only does it enhance worship for those of us that when we start coming back to worship, when this season of the pandemic passes, but also it allows us to keep reaching out into our community, which is God's vision, isn't it? That we would reach out and share his love to all that we meet. And so I just want to thank you for those of you that have already so generously started giving to that, and just want to encourage you that our gift day is open for about another 3 weeks, so there is still loads of opportunity for you to join with God, for you to join with what God is doing in the church, and to be able to give what he feels he's calling you to give. And so I would just encourage you to keep praying and asking God, what is it that if you're able to give, whatever that amount is, it doesn't matter. It's not, we don't look at it in terms of human terms, in whether this is a large or a small gift. We just say, God, what do you want me to bring? And when we bring that freely, God blesses that. So I just want to encourage you to keep praying in to that if you haven't given yet, and know that you'll be richly blessed because you'll be joining with what God is doing. I also just want to say that we're currently, after our 21 days of prayer and fasting, looking at the best times to have our prayer times throughout the week. But for the moment, we're still meeting on a Monday evening at 8 p.m. This is all online. We're actually now, we're starting meeting. We're going to meet on a Thursday noon as well, so you can bring your lunch with you. That will probably be a shorter time that we'll meet together at noon, at 12 midday on a Thursday, and then we're still meeting at 8:30 on a Saturday morning. And the Zoom code for all those prayer times is the same. It's 212-2021-121. That's 212-2021-121. And it's good, isn't it? So good that we can still meet online during this time. Well, friends, 4 weeks today, it will be Easter Sunday. Can you believe it? 4 weeks today, Easter Sunday. And many in the Christian church, are now in that season of Lent, that period of journey that takes place from Ash Wednesday and finishes on Easter Saturday. Personally, for me, Lent it's not something that I've observed much throughout my life, probably due to it not being something that features heavily in the Baptist tradition in the same way that it does in the Anglican Church and in the Catholic Church, because they have it as part of their yearly calendar. But I just want to say, for those that do partake in observing Lent, there's obviously nothing wrong with that. Fasting from something, which is what Lent is. And in Lent, you often give up something. You fast from something. Doing that to get closer to God is a powerful and a great spiritual practice. It's something that we've done as a church, wasn't it, last month when we did 21 days of prayer and fasting. Choosing to do this, as many Christian traditions do during Lent, is a good thing to do, providing it's not seen as a means to get spiritual merit from God, or to for some act of penance. So while as a church we may not practice Lent in the same way as other church denominations do, in this season that we're in, we are going to think about what is often thought about during Lent as these are good things of God, and we want to draw those in to our own lives. And so with that in mind, we're going to spend the next 3 weeks thinking about the 3 temptations of Jesus as he spends time in the wilderness, because that passage, that time that Jesus was in the wilderness is often thought about during Lent, because Jesus fasted from food and from everything really for those 40 days. And so with all of that in mind, today we start a new 3-part series called The Road Less Travelled. And for the next 3 weeks, as I said, we're going to be thinking about the temptations that Jesus faced when he was in the wilderness. And the reason for the title is that Jesus' response to these temptations are not necessarily a common response. They're not the responses that most of us have, but we can learn an awful lot from Jesus' response. And so I want to take us on a journey so that we respond by going down the road less travelled that Jesus went down. And before we get into this morning, let's have a listen to the first passage that's often associated with this season of Lent. And we're going to hear it from Matthew's Gospel.
Morning. This reading is taken from the book of Matthew, chapter 4, verses 1 to 11. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted there by the devil. For 40 days and 40 nights he fasted and became very hungry. During that time, the devil came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus told him, "No. The scriptures say, people do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city, Jerusalem, to the highest point of the temple, and said, "If you are the Son of God, jump off, for the scriptures say, he will order his angels to protect you, and they will hold you up with their hands, so you won't even hurt your foot on a stone." Jesus responded, "The scriptures also say, you must not test the Lord your God." Next, the devil took him to the peak of a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. "I will give it all to you," he said, "if you will kneel down and worship me." "Get out of here, Satan," Jesus told him, "for the scriptures say, you must worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil went away, and angels came and took care of Jesus.
Thanks, Joe, for reading that for us today. It was great. Have you noticed, from the moment we are born, we're taught about independence? From an early age, babies are taught to settle themselves. You know, we call it controlled crying, don't we? I'm not getting into whether you're for or against that. It is just one theory in parenting, one of many that's out there. But we then start feeding our kids stuff other than milk, don't we? And we get them to hold the spoon and to try and put it in their own mouths. And we then give them solids and we get them to hold the food and play with it and make a huge mess. And all of that is in the goal of independence, that they can go from us feeding them to them being able to feed themselves. And then after months of carrying them around, we teach them to sit on their own, to sit up, to then crawl, to that moment of enlightenment when they walk. We do the same with talking and then potty training, with going to the toilet on their own, to dressing themselves. You know, that moment when your kids can dress themselves, wow, you suddenly have the gift of time, don't you? To tying their own shoelaces, to trying to do their schoolwork on their own, to run in their own bath, to cleaning up after themselves, to walking to school on their own, to learning to drive, to leaving home, to getting married, to having children for themselves. And then it all starts all over again, only with their children, your grandchildren. But if you think about it, it's true, isn't it? We live lives of teaching each other to be independent. Job applications forms often have a question about, how are you at working independently? You see, life is about independence. Can you remember your first taste of independence? I remember getting a key to the house so I could let myself in when my mum and dad were at work. I can't tell you how many times I lost that key, but I also can't tell you how amazing it felt when I had a key. It was a sense, it was that moment in time. It was a milestone. I've got a key to the house. I remember being able to drive, longing to be able to drive so that I could have my independence, only to pass my test and find that cars are expensive. There's petrol, there's tax, there's MOT, you have to service them. And so I may have been able to drive, but I couldn't afford to go anywhere. As I got older and got a job and then had to pay for things myself, gas, electricity, food, all of that kind of stuff, I realised that actually independence is not all it's cracked up to be, is it? But friends, can you remember your first taste of independence? Maybe, like me, it was having a key to the house, or it was a driver's license. But those around you were teaching you small steps of independence long before that went all the way back to you being taught how to crawl, how to sit, how to walk, how to hold a spoon, and all of those kind of things. Interestingly, now I'm a dad myself, the thought of my 12-year-old having a key to the front door and letting herself in when neither my wife or I are here and she's here on her own, I have to tell you, that level of independence for her fills me with complete horror. But dependence and independence are interesting concepts, are they not? Maybe you have people that depend on you, and actually you quite like that because it gives you a feeling of importance, of security and control. My kids are dependent upon me for most things in life, and they're happy about that. Yes, they have a far more wide level of independence now. They're 9 and 12 than they had when they were babies. But for the most part, for a roof over their head and being taken to different places and having food put in food, they're dependent upon me. But the time will come, and I know it will come, when they simply don't need me in the same way. Unless it is to drive them somewhere or to give them money, but they will, it's the natural order, it's the right order of things, that they move from being dependent upon me as their father to being independent from me. And while that's the natural order of life, I have to tell you, as a dad, I really don't like it. And I wonder if, like me, this gets you thinking about how do we live dependent lives on God? Or do we live independent from God? Because while life is about learning to live independently, we can take that to mean that we don't need anybody, that we don't need anything, that actually we don't need God, and we just rely on ourselves. And let's be honest, that's where we get into trouble most of the time. Jesus' time in the wilderness, that we heard from what Joe read to us a few moments ago, is dominated by the 3 temptations that Jesus faced. And for us, temptation is all around us, isn't it? Every day we can face temptations. They can range from the seemingly small and insignificant temptations, like having that extra biscuit or checking social media when you should be working and being sucked into a vortex of 30 minutes before you know it, of complete wasted time, to more significant temptations like being tempted to spend money we don't have, or spending time with somebody that we know we shouldn't spend time with them, because if our husbands or wives found out about it, they wouldn't really be happy. And there are a whole host of other temptations, both large and small. And you see, temptations are what the devil uses to bring bad into our lives. And his ultimate goal in those temptations is to take us, to draw us, to tempt us away from God. And he does this in subtle ways. Often we don't even realize that we're being tempted. Now, I appreciate that some of you are now thinking, oh no, he's mentioned the devil, and you're not too sure what you think about the devil. Some of you may not like this, and you try not to think about the devil at all. And I want to say that I believe the enemy exists, and we have to be on our guard. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Screwtape Letters, talks about the two categories that many Christians fall into. Either you're in that category where you blame the devil for everything. You've got a runny nose, or somebody's taken your parking space, and instantly that's the devil's fault. Or everything is the devil's fault. You stub your toe and that's the devil's fault. Or you that's one group of Christians. Another group is that you don't acknowledge the devil at all. And you say the attack of the enemy has no relevance in any situation in life. And C.S. Lewis says, actually, both categories are wrong. And God's wisdom helps us recognize when the enemy is at work and to discern how and why temptations come, so that we can see them for what they are, and that in itself can take the sting out of the tail. And you see, one of the reasons that not everything is an attack of the enemy is because the enemy, while powerful, the devil is not like God. God is everywhere. The devil cannot be everywhere. He doesn't have that same level of power that God has. And so when stuff happens to us, sometimes the enemy is attacking us. And sometimes I believe it is just life. Being life, as C.S. Lewis says, not everything is an attack from the enemy, but we need to realize that some things are, and temptations are often there, because Satan is trying to draw us away from God, and we need to be aware of that. Now, in Jesus' temptations in the wilderness, we see he gets the balance right, as Jesus doesn't overemphasize the devil's power, but he doesn't dismiss it completely either, and he uses the Bible to defend himself against the enemy's attacks. And you see, we need to remember right at the start of this series that Jesus, yes, was fully divine, he was fully God, but he was also fully human as well. So these temptations would have been real to him. These attacks from the enemy, that they hurt. He was really tempted to give in, and he had to dig deep and push into God to overcome that. And today we're going to think about the first temptation of Jesus, and I'm going to read it again to us this morning. We read, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted there by the devil. For 40 days and 40 nights he fasted and became very hungry. During that time the devil came and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become loaves of bread.' But Jesus told him, 'No, the scriptures say people do not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God.'" To put it mildly, at this moment, Jesus was famished. He was starving. He hadn't had anything to eat for 40 days. And it's in that moment that the devil pops up and tempts him by encouraging him to use his power to get himself some bread. And notice the devil preys on Jesus' weakness of being hungry. Now, not only was this a weakness, because when you're fasting, especially from food, all you can think about is food. Everything you look at looks like food. Every advert on television is about food. Food just seems to be all around you. It's all you can think about. And so when the devil suggests that Jesus turns these stones into bread, those stones, they might have looked like little bread rolls, or a loaf or a baguette or whatever. All of that stuff would have just, Jesus would have been looking at it. The enemy has said, "Why don't you turn these into bread?" He would have been looking at those stones and seeing bread seen hot bread with lashings of salty butter and jam, and oh man, that looked absolutely amazing. It would have seemed so appealing to him in that moment. And it's in that moment, Jesus' weakness and hunger is when the devil swoops in and he uses that weakness against Jesus. You know, the devil isn't tempting Jesus with something he's not battling with. The devil doesn't say to Jesus, oh Jesus, what, you know, you've got so much power. If you're the Son of God, why don't you make the ground open up and there's a lovely swimming pool with a wonderful slide going into the water? The devil doesn't do that to Jesus, because in that moment, Jesus' weakness wasn't that he wanted to swim. Jesus' weakness was that he wanted some food. And this is important for us because we need to see that the devil preys on our weaknesses. And because of that, it's important that we know what our weaknesses are. Because when you know what your weaknesses are, you can ask God to help you to put measures in place to combat those. But also to give you an awareness of what your weaknesses are, because that's where the enemy's going to attack you. You know, the enemy isn't going to attack you on something that you're quite strong in. He's going to swoop in and he's going to see that chink in your armor. You know, it's a silly example, but when I get hungry, I get cranky. And when I get really hungry, I get really cranky. I'm just being honest with you, you know, and it means that the smallest things can become major for me in that moment. Throughout my marriage, my wife, Jem, she knows all of this about me. And so if we're going out, if we're going anywhere remotely important, or even if we're just leaving the house and I haven't eaten, she says, have something to eat first. Because I'm not taking you there where you can get cranky, where you can get annoyed, when something can happen and it's all because you're a bit hungry. When my wife was in labour with our daughter, even before we went to the hospital, my wife got me to have something to eat, because she knew that obviously this could be a long process at hospital, quite a stressful time, you know, having the birth of a child and the birth of your first child. And she knew that I could get cranky in that moment. So she goes, before I go to the hospital, she's in labour, my wife is in labour. And before we get in the car to go to the hospital, she makes me have something to eat so that she knows I'm not going to get cranky because I'm hungry. Because she knows I do not cope well without having food. And so that's where the devil is at. That's where the devil comes in for Jesus in that moment. After 40 days, he's starving. His weakness is he wants something to eat, and the devil attacks him at that point. But also, Jesus' weakness was not just in the fact that he was hungry, but his hunger caused a literal weakness within him. You know, if you're hungry, if you haven't eaten for a long time, your blood sugar drops, you feel weak. And so, you know, the devil preyed on that with Jesus, because he not only hits Jesus with a weakness because he knows he wants food, he hits Jesus when he knows he's feeling weak, when he's at his lowest point. You know, when he's hoping to catch Jesus not thinking straight. He didn't come to Jesus, you know, when he's feeling all strong, when he's just had a big meal, right at the start of his fast. Don't come to him then because he's not hungry. Come to him when he's hungry, but he's been without food for such a long time, he's struggling in his body. That's when the enemy comes as well. So for you and I, you know, we've got weaknesses. We've got things that the devil will tempt us with. And he's not likely to come and tempt us when we're feeling strong, because he knows we're going to overcome that easily. He's going to come maybe when we're just feeling tired in our body. Maybe when we're feeling low, when we're feeling a bit sorry for ourselves, or whatever it is. That's when the enemy comes. And so we need to be aware that just as the enemy attacked Jesus when he did and with what he did, he will do the same with us. When our energy levels are low, when our mood is low, when we're at the end of a season of struggle. Now I say all of this today because it's important to know the character of temptation and the way that the enemy works. And so in this first temptation, as the devil comes to Jesus, we're not only the devil can see that Jesus has a weakness for food because he hasn't eaten, but he can see that he's physically weak and tempts him with a solution to feed his hunger. We need to ask, what is at the heart of this temptation? Because on the surface, there's nothing wrong with having a piece of bread. But you see, just the idea of the piece of bread, of feeding himself, that is not at the heart of this temptation. Because we need to see that this temptation is far more than satisfying Jesus' hunger. It's a temptation to get Jesus to change his priorities when he's right at his lowest point. It's a temptation that asks the question, where does your dependence lie? Obviously, it's okay to eat. Look through the Bible and you see Jesus eating. A lot of good conversations happen around a meal table. Jesus is having a meal with people he's just met. Zacchaeus, he's up a tree. Come down, Zacchaeus. He doesn't say, come down, Zacchaeus. I just want to talk to you. I want to put you straight. He says, come down, Zacchaeus. I'm going to eat in your house tonight. Jesus is accused of socializing, of eating with what the religious leaders of the day saw as the unsavories, with the tax collectors, with the bad people, with the sinners, as they called them. But, Jesus cooked food for the disciples. He ate with the disciples. He fed thousands of people, But in this first temptation, the devil is playing on Jesus' hunger and getting him to depend on food as opposed to be dependent on the Father. He's getting him to depend on himself as the Son of God and his power, and in doing so, get him to see that he doesn't need God, that he can go it alone. And that is at the heart of this temptation. But what I love about it is that Jesus doesn't give in. Because even though Jesus has the power to do anything, even though Jesus could have had control over the natural world because he was fully divine as well as being fully human, he knows his dependence on the Father is far better, and so he chooses to act in submission to the Father. He stands strong in the face of a tough temptation and chooses dependence on God as opposed to dependence over his need for food and his need to be able to have sorted that. Because think about it, how tough must this have been, especially for Jesus, especially for the Son of God, for the Messiah, for the Saviour of the world. He could have turned these stones into bread, and not just basic white bread. He could have had a garlic and rosemary focaccia. He could have had French bread. He could have had a sourdough bread. He could have had a lovely sourdough bread made with rye flour. He could have had a lovely bread with seeds running through it and olive oil. He could have made the best bread imaginable. You think of, Paul Hollywood. Paul Hollywood has nothing on the bread that Jesus could make. So it's, Jesus could have done anything like that. He could have had this bread. He would have known the smell, how much it looks when you break it and get the crust cracks and, just amazing. Jesus could have had all of that because he was capable of doing it. And this is what makes this first temptation a real challenge, because Jesus had the means to do it. And yet he still chose to be dependent on his Father. Throughout the 40 days, even before the devil comes and tempts him, Jesus could have done it, couldn't he? Jesus could have said, look, there's nobody around. I'm just going to make these stones into bread. It's going to be all right. Nobody will ever know. It's only a bit of bread after all. And you see, that weakness of being able to do it is something that the devil preys on as well. Dependence on God is hard enough when we find ourselves in a situation where we can't solve it. We can't do what needs to be done. And in that moment, it's almost as if we have no choice but to depend on God. But to have dependence on God when it is something that we could do, now that shows a level of trust in God, of faith, of reliance, of a relationship that is powerful. And that is what Jesus is showing you, because Jesus could have done it, but he put his relationship with God first. It's why Jesus says in Matthew 6:33, seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and he will give you everything you need. It's about putting God first above absolutely everything else, whether you could do it or not. It's about being totally dependent upon God for all of your life. In the Passion Translation of that verse, it says, so above all, constantly chase after the realm of God's kingdom and the righteousness that proceeds from him. Then all these less important things will be given to you abundantly. As Jesus is in the wilderness, fasting for 40 days, when the devil comes after him with all that he's got, Jesus shows his dependency upon his Father by chasing after him. Not just now and then, but constantly. This isn't just for this season, I'll chase after God, but not for that season. This is, I'm going after God, I'm chasing after God constantly, no matter what season of life I'm in, no matter what's going on, whether I'm in a situation where I can sort it or whether I'm in a situation where I can't, I'm going to constantly chase after God. That is what putting God first, that's what seeking God with all of your heart above all everything else means. Jesus in the wilderness could have sorted his hunger out. He could have turned those stones into bread, and yet he chooses to chase after God, to put his dependence in him, believing that God would supply what he needed when he needed it. And in quoting scripture back to the devil about us not living on bread alone, he is showing that yes, the bread would be amazing right about now, but a life with God is far more satisfying and far more needed than simply what I want right now. And I think in this temptation, Jesus shows a deep level of dependency upon the Father that's so powerful. Far more powerful than giving in to his hunger. And we know this because the devil then moves on to another temptation when he can see that nothing's going to break Jesus' dependency on his Father. And so what about you? Does the enemy move on because he can see that he can't break you, that you're dependent upon God? Or does the enemy keep at it because actually you give in all too easily and your dependency is on other things or yourself as opposed to God? And so therefore then when the temptations come, it's so easy to give in. Or if not, what is it that you're dependent on? Are there people you're dependent on? Are there skills and abilities that you're dependent on? Do you have a bank balance that you're dependent on? Do you have a career that you're dependent on? Now, before you go and get rid of all of that, or even shout at the screen right now that what on earth, is it bad to have those things? No, of course it's not. There's nothing wrong with any of those things. There are people in our lives that are good for us, that we go to, and it's right and proper. We all have different skills and abilities that we can use in different situations, and that can really help us. If you're able to save money, that's good. It's good to be able to do those things, to be good stewards of our money, and this can help us to not get into debt. And earning a wage that we can buy things is how we live life, isn't it? And being good at your job and progressing up a career ladder, it's a good thing to do. But ask yourself, are these things the things in your life that you rely on more than you rely on God? Are you dependent on God even though you have the means to do it yourself? Do you bring everything to God in complete submission to him and his will for you, so that you can see if this is what he wants for your life? Or because you can, do you simply plow on through regardless because you can do it and you have the means to do it, and you somehow shoehorn God's will into your circumstances once you've already done it? You see, Jesus could have turned these stones into bread, and he could have said, oh, it's okay, it's only a bit of bread. My Father would not want me to starve. And he could have shoehorned God's will into what he had done by being reliant, dependent on himself. But that was not God's will for him in that moment. Dependence on God sees us submitting to God above everything else and following his will for us, even when it is different to ours, or even when we could do it another way. Often in life we see dependence as a weakness, as a negative thing. The strong way is to say that we're independent. We're not dependent on anything or anyone, and I can do it myself. And in this temptation, Jesus shows us another way. And if Jesus, the Son of God, showed what it was to be dependent on God, I think you and I, we certainly need to be dependent on God. Jesus could have done anything, and yet he let that go to submit himself to his Father. So where does your dependence lie, friends? You know, if you're fasting at the moment or at other times when the temptation comes to give in, what do you depend on in those moments? Do you depend on willpower or reasoning with yourself? Do you depend on someone else talking you down, or do you turn to God in his word and prayer and worship? You know, if you're struggling with deep-rooted temptations, and actually they've gone from temptations and they're addictions in your life, where do you turn to when you're tempted to give in? You know, in those situations, I think turning to God and being dependent on God may be that you actually seek help, that you seek advice and support from trained professionals, or you have someone that you allow yourself to be accountable to. But, you know, I think for many of us, it's quite subtle and almost simple. We become dependent upon ourselves. And this temptation shows that's not the best way to live. You know, often feelings of being overwhelmed are because we're depending on ourselves to do it all, to sort it all, to achieve what we feel needs to be achieved. And we walk around carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders. And God never wanted that. God says, hand it to me. Be dependent upon me. You know, do you work longer hours because you feel you need to somehow achieve more? Do you check your emails before you go to sleep, and the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning is you pick up your phone and you check your emails because somehow you think it all depends on you? Has Sabbath become something that only happens in monasteries? You know, you haven't got time for a Sabbath. When a season of struggle hits your life, what's the first thing that you do? Do you try to sort it all out? Or do you stop and seek God and then do what you sense he is saying to your heart? You know, friends, this isn't about not doing anything, but this is about doing the right thing first, and that's showing that dependence on God. I think the temptation that many of us fall into is one of dependence upon ourselves, as opposed to true and complete dependence on God. Let's draw this to a close. This last year, we've had a year, haven't we, like never before. Our lives have been shaken. Our faith has been shaken. Many of the things that we have depended upon have been taken away from us. But, you know, this can be a good thing, because if we allow it, this can lead us to be fully dependent on God. You know, the role of the church is to show Jesus to the world. It's to show the world that there's another way to live, that it doesn't all come down to us. And the wonderful thing is, God never wanted us to live as if we felt we had to hold it all anyway. And so may we let go and let God do what he does best. And in doing so, I believe we will live differently. That's why Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He's talking about us allowing ourselves to be dependent on him and not our own selves, not our own sense that we always have to be the ones that do it. And when we do that, we find rest in life, for we find life itself. Friends, let's reflect on this. We're going to come around the communion table. Your table is going to join with everybody else's table, with God's big table. But before we partake in that, we're going to worship God by singing, "This is my desire." And may your desire be God. That's the bottom line. May your desire, may your dependency be God. And as we sing this, allow yourself. I just want to encourage you as we sing this song, as we worship God, just to allow yourself to fall into his arms, to let it go, and to allow him to pick it up and to pick you up. This is my desire.